Hello and welcome to today's program, New Thought on Korea and Unification. This is the first in a new series authored here at the Korea Society and is funded by UniKorea Foundation based in Seoul, South Korea. My name is Tom Byrne and I'm president of the Korea Society. This series aims to promote dialogue and awareness on issues related to Korean Peninsula peace and security. Welcome to our speakers, Markus and Soo, who both join us for the first time. And we welcome Ankit back to the Society for his third appearance. Now I'd like to turn the screen over to Senior Director for Policy, Stephen Norper.
Thank you, President Byrne, and thank you all for joining us. We're delighted to have you streaming, listening. It is a special day in that we're welcoming a new funder, as President Byrne mentioned, UniKorea, and our congratulations go to the host for today's session, Jonathan Corrado, who helped bring that grant to the Korea Society. The Korea Society relies on policy funding from the Korea Foundation and from friends and supporters in the foundation and corporate communities, as well as individuals. And those also include the Sherman family, which sponsors the Emerging Korea Scholar Lecture Series, as well as the United Nations for the UN Dialogue Series, and to the Kim Koo Foundation for our professional series at the Korea Society. So it's always exciting to have a new funder, and Jonathan will be digging deep with the UniKorea series among experts who really will add great nuance to these discussions, today being that discussion on diplomacy and North Korea. We'd like to thank all of our audience members, especially from the corporate community, from media, from the United Nations, from the US government and other governments watching, as well as those academics and students of international relations. And now over to Jonathan Corrado.
Thanks very much, Stephen, and welcome all. It's an exciting day. We're so glad that you could join us for our kickoff of this new program series. Today, we're going to be talking about prospects for diplomacy with North Korea. This always seems to be a timely topic, but recent developments add some extra relevance. Yesterday, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said that efforts are underway with allies and North Korea to identify opportunities to resume talks. At the same time, we're approaching a Workers' Party anniversary in early October and a US election in November, two occasions that have historically been associated with North Korean provocations. We're lucky to be joined today by three speakers who bring considerable insight and nuance to this discussion. They can help us to see through the cycle of talks and breakdowns to identify some core trends. It's my pleasure to introduce them. First up is Markus Garlauskas. He was the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea. As such, he led the US intelligence community's strategic analysis on North Korea issues. He's now a non-resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security within the Asia Security Initiative. Next is Soo Kim. She's a policy analyst at the RAND Corporation and an adjunct instructor at American University. She was a North Korea analyst at the CIA, specializing in decision-making and regime propaganda. And we are also lucky to be joined by Ankit Panda. He's the Stanton Senior Fellow in the Nuclear Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the author of a new book entitled Kim Jong-un and the Bomb. So go out and get your copy today. Thank you, Markus, Soo, Ankit, for joining us today. I wonder if we could start by getting to know a little bit more about you all. I think our viewers are interested to learn a little bit about your background, your professional journey. So can you tell us, how did you start to develop an interest in North Korea, and how has your engagement with the issue evolved over time? Markus, maybe we could start with you.
So thanks very much for this opportunity. So because we have to get on to some substantive topics, I will not give you all the nuances of my long and interesting journey so far. Bottom line is my interest in Korea really started, I would say, in grade school or middle school. I was even in the Model UN on the South Korea team at our school.
Nice.
So I actually had a chance to rail against North Korean missile launches at a very early age. I focused really on military and security issues early in my education. I was a junior ROTC cadet, commander of my class in high school, went through Army ROTC and really planned a military career and focused regionally, actually, ironically enough, a lot more on Europe just because of my interest in military history and looking at the conflicts in Europe. Ran into some medical issues, so like a couple of my role models, the real world role model, General Scowcroft, and the fictional role model, Jack Ryan of Tom Clancy's novels, I decided then to focus on strategy and intelligence rather than combat as my specialty. And so as a result, then I went back to graduate school, got a master's from Georgetown, and there is where I did my strategic pivot to focus on Korea issues. I came to the conclusion that Northeast Asia was going to play a similar role for U.S. national security interests in the 21st century as it did in the as Europe did in the 20th, and so I needed to focus on Asia, and Korea being in the center of Northeast Asia, this critical strategic terrain. I decided to focus on Korea, and so I started working in the Department of the Army at the National War College for a while, and then got the opportunity to take an assignment out to Korea. And the rest, as they say, is history. Very interesting work in the intelligence field there, working on estimative, forward-looking intelligence. Then I got the opportunity to take over the strategy division, which was exciting. Took me out of the IC for about 5 years, directly advising the 4-star in that role in a multinational environment. And then got the opportunity to come back to the States and spent just under 6 years as the National Intelligence Officer for North Korea, informing high-level policy decisions. So it's been an exciting journey, and I'm looking forward to the next stage now that I'm outside of the government. I can speak a lot more on these issues. So thanks for the question.
Thanks so much. We look forward to hearing those views on those issues. Another example of John Lennon's maxim that life is what happens to you when you're out making other plans. So thank you, Markus. And can we turn now to Soo?
Sure. So my background is not as extensive as Markus's, but I will keep mine short. I actually did not intend on doing Korea issues from the get-go. I studied French in college, earned my BA in French from Yale. I wanted to actually go into journalism. So I focused on censorship in the 19th century Paris artistic and the literature realm. Stumbled upon literally the CIA job, got recruited straight out of college. My first job out of college was within the North Korean propaganda shop. From there, I think my eyes started to get bigger, and also I started to have a curiosity about North Korea issues. So it really started out as like a blithe fascination towards this novel concept called North Korea. From there, I got a serious indoctrination into the propaganda, the strategy, and what the ideology was all about. Transitioned into all source analysis. There, I think I became slightly more awakened to the realities of the Korea problem. But even then, I think I still thought of it as just a rigorous intellectual or professional exercise. It was actually not until I would say mid 2018 when I actually wanted to go back into North Korea issues more seriously. As you recall, we saw the summitry and just very, at the time, what seemed like very new atmospherics in Korea. I happened to be in Seoul at the time, and a lot of things just came to me very differently, perceptually, and also I think the general tone of South Korean political culture, the youth perception of North Korea, the U.S. alliance was all just very like goosebump inducing for me. So I decided that I wanted to jump into this more seriously. And I started working at RAND in 2019. And prior to that, I was with the DHS doing all sorts of policy and strategic outlining. So I think for me, one thing I keep reminding myself is that with North Korea, I mean, the number of years we serve is clearly is very important, but it's a constant problem that continues to morph and also just adapt to the way we respond to North Korea as well. So it's always been a learning process for me. So I look forward to learning from the panelists and also from our, I guess, audience as well.
Thank you so much, Soo, and totally agree that those language skills and that perspective from South Korea is so value enhancing. So look forward to getting some of your views as well as that propaganda training. What can we learn about prospects for diplomacy given North Korea's propaganda statements? Now let's turn over to Ankit. Ankit.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's always a pleasure to be with the Korea Society. Although, as I said on Twitter, I really hope we'll be back in the physical space soon. I really do miss it. So my story is a little bit, actually quite different from both Markus and Soo. I mean, for starters, I've never been in government. I'm a recent American citizen. So when I started working on North Korean issues, I was still in my former capacity. I was originally an Indian citizen, and I had an interest in international security and proliferation issues, going back to really undergrad and earlier in some ways. Of course, I think the first time I really realized that I was starting to become a North Korea watcher, and Sue's absolutely right. I mean, North Korea watching, I think the people that do this and do this best make it a habit, and it's an ongoing process, as Sue said. And I remember canceling dinner plans here in New York after I think KCNA released to the world that Changsong Tech was no more. That was late, December 2013. And I think I just remember that moment because that was the first time I actually changed what I was planning to do in my day-to-day life to follow developments in North Korea. And of course, at that time, I was in a journalistic role, so I was writing about that. And then, of course, events developed. The Pyeongjin campaign that Kim Jong-un initiated in early 2013 really started to hit its stride with regular missile testing. And of course, here on the U.S. East Coast, most of those missile tests took place in the evenings. So many canceled plans later, I began to realize that this was starting to take over my life. And before you know it, North Korea was what I was doing 80-90% of my time. And of course, 2017 really, I think that hit its maximum level. Maximum pressure in many ways was something I experienced professionally at the time, and that of course turned into a book project down the line. And today, I find myself reading KCNA almost daily, trying to keep up with new developments in North Korea, trying to crack the black box from the outside. But I'm really looking forward to joining my very experienced and distinguished panelists today. So thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you so much, Ankit. And your story reminds us that anyone who's looking for a career path that will provide ample opportunities to cancel social plans, North Korea is a good one. You can definitely get that opportunity. So let's start with a big picture question, looking at things from the US perspective. Why haven't we been able to secure a nuclear deal with North Korea so far? How do we evaluate the challenges and opportunities for policymakers in the road ahead? Are we doomed to repeat these endless cycles of provocation and reconciliation? Markus, can you lead us off here?
So I think the bottom line up front is the reason we haven't been able to get a deal for North Korea to fully and verifiably denuclearize is because North Korea has no intention of giving up its nuclear weapons, much less allowing a robust verification program that would show that has taken place. And this is not a particularly new development. And to me, I think one of the biggest challenges that we have to overcome, that the United States has to overcome in formulating North Korea policy, is having a realistic set of assumptions and assessments upon which to base that policy, and then actually using those realistic assessments and assumptions. So I love to refer back to this memorandum that was published by the National Intelligence Council, my former organization, long before I arrived in 1991. Actually, long before I even made my pivot to Asia. This now declassified memo actually says that North Korea would not be coerced into giving up its nuclear program through sanctions. This is back in 1991, before North Korea has done any nuclear tests. And that was the assessment back then. So obviously we don't have declassified assessments necessarily for the whole period in between, but that tells you sort of we were perhaps starting with an unrealistic premise that sanctions and pressure would be the tool to get North Korea to do something that it fundamentally was not going to be willing to do sincerely. So I think also another element that we have to keep in mind that's really a big challenge is how much progress North Korea has made, particularly the progress they showed in testing in 2016 and 2017. So the accelerated weapons testing, including the first ICBM test launches and the largest nuclear test to date, they demonstrate really the amount of progress that North Korea has made. And then, of course, we have the assessments in terms of the growing size of the nuclear arsenal coming out from a variety of sources. And so SIPRI, and then, of course, you see an assessment that came out in a recent U.S. Army publication pointing out that North Korea, has at this point a pretty significant amount of fissile material. We can talk more about the implications of that later, but I think that foundation of the fact that North Korea has a significant stockpile of fissile material. It's tested nuclear devices on so many occasions. It's tested increasingly advanced missiles. I mean, I think these show the level of the challenge. And I think the first step is we have to fully recognize the scope of the problem, how much progress that North Korea has made, and that fundamentally North Korea at this point anyway, and maybe we can change their minds, does not want to give up its nuclear weapons. I think that's the fundamental challenge. That's why we haven't been able to make a deal, is because ultimately the terms we're asking for are not terms that North Korea is genuinely interested in.
Thank you so much, Markus. And I have to make a shout out to the swag behind you. You've got the awesome North Korean propaganda poster, Joseon의 대답, and also the summit mug. So thanks for showing off your swag to us.
Oh, thank you.
And now can we go to Sue? Sue, what are your thoughts here?
Sure. So Markus just mentioned our, I guess, inability to really recognize and really feel within our skin the scope of the North Korea problem. I think that's a good segue actually into what I wanted to discuss was we could look at the negotiations over the nuclear weapons program, or I guess just dealing with North Korea period in this form of ledger. So our ledger balance versus what North Korea has. We can say that we weren't able to give North Koreans what they wanted, and that's why we're here where we are. But I think another way to examine the current state and probably the future state as well, unless things really change, is to look at, I guess, the flaws or Achilles heel in the way that we approach North Korea generally. I think that relatedly, based on what Markus said, we tend to project our own expectations onto the problem. So we expect Pyongyang to stay within the, shall we say, frontiers that we've delineated for North Korea. But with that, we don't really articulate precisely the consequences, or we don't really show or posture what would happen to North Korea, what would happen to US-North Korea relations if North Korea were to sort of push the boundaries, to redraw the line, or to even, I would say, just push the limits further. Relatedly, I think we also tend to reduce the North Korea problem as, and I think I'm guilty of this myself, but we tend to think of this as this fascinating intellectual puzzle to solve. I think that helps us to get a better understanding of North Korea, probably in a static state. But I think given that, one, as Markus mentioned, that the progress that North Korea has been able to make with its nuclear weapons program, with its strategy towards its regional neighbors and such, that it just does not fit sometimes the realities of dealing with North Korea. So the intellectual puzzle and the exercise, while it helps us to stretch our own limits and to test our assumptions, sometimes it doesn't really match with the existential growing threat that is North Korea. And lastly, I think that we, especially in the last several years, we set a timeline for solving North Korea problem XYZ. I mean, nuclear weapons is one thing, but just dealing with North Korea. So we tend to impose this sense of urgency. And that, I think, is also projected towards North Korea. And they see that we want something more than they do. So whether it's an actual sit down, face-to-face negotiations, or if it's just a matter of, our strategy versus theirs and which one is able to gain more ground, the fact of the matter is that they're able to see that we're willing to forego something, X, Y, Z, whereas North Korea has not really delineated what it is that it's willing to give up. So this, I think, just the artificial timelines, the self-imposed constraints, just for the sake of achieving something, a deal or a policy success, I think it poses a lot of, it creates more gaps, of course, in our perception, but I think it also sometimes makes us sort of regress in dealing with North Korea.
Thanks so much, Sue. And your good pointer conjures up former Secretary of Defense Bill Perry's advice that we must deal with North Korea as it is, not as we wish it to be. Ankit, can we turn to you? How do you see things?
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to say something a little different. I mean, even though I share a lot of the perspectives shared by Markus and Sue on this issue, I'll begin in an abstract place and hopefully bring us down to reality by the time I finish talking. I mean, so the way I think about negotiations of the kind that we've been trying to do with North Korea is through a very traditional model, right? And I don't want to get too wonky, but something like, what two-level game theory might teach us about two sides who come to the negotiating table, each with so-called win sets, trying to figure out where their win sets overlap. And really, for a negotiation to succeed, you need to find that overlap in your win set with the other side's win set. And of course, these win sets aren't public. So like Soo just said, I mean, the North Koreans over the years, many people on the call might be familiar with North Korean complaints about the hostile policy that the United States has against North Korea, that they claim at various times involves strategic assets, forces on the Korean Peninsula, other issues around the peninsula. But of course, we've never received an itemized list of items from the North Koreans that they perceive to belong to that hostile policy. So there is value in a negotiation to holding some of your cards close to the chest, but ideally in that negotiating setting, you will learn a little bit about what the other side's win set is. And I think this is partly what happened in Hanoi, and really the lesson both sides walked away during that failed summit in February 2019 was the understanding that because of the false premises that had led them to that negotiating table that day in Hanoi, there was no common win set. The United States was fundamentally looking for something from the North Koreans that they were not ready to give up, which was agreeing to a full roadmap for their complete denuclearization. That said, if we continue to make the strategic decision with North Korea that time is on our side, that we can afford to wait and we can afford to continue to wait and see what sanctions might do to North Korea's strategic calculus about nuclear weapons, that's a dangerous bet. And that's a bet that I think North Korea is showing us is very unlikely to pay off. Primarily, it's because of what Markus said, that quantitatively and qualitatively, the lesson we've learned from the North Koreans, really going back to the collapse of the agreed framework in late 2002, is that time isn't really on our side. The North Koreans will have more weapons, better weapons. And, I'm saying this, of course, not so long after Kim Jong-un promised the world to reveal a new strategic weapon. Some of us are wondering if that's going to happen in the next few weeks as we head up to this October 10th anniversary of the 75th year of the founding of the Korean Workers' Party. But North Korea can continue to push ahead. Their strategic decision to make their nuclear arsenal the cornerstone of their national defense strategy is very unlikely to change. And that should affect how we reassess what our win set on the Korean Peninsula looks like. We, of course, have to account for several things in making that decision. And I'm hoping the next president will decide to conduct a policy review where we look into things like how our allies feel about reevaluating North Korea policy, the implications for the non-proliferation regime of taking a different approach to North Korea, what can practically be done in the short term to cap and reduce North Korea's capabilities. But all of these would require a significant reassessment of the conditions that we understand as constituting victory in a negotiation with North Korea.
Thanks, Ankit. I think that's really helpful metric to keep in mind. And of course, the premise for the current strategy of waiting out and hoping that sanctions will induce some sort of policy change is that the economic pain brought on by the sanctions will strike at the top leadership's assessment of their own interests. And I think that's an assessment that we might want to revisit. And this also serves as a nice transition to our third question, which is we just looked at things from the US perspective, and now I want to look at the North Korean dynamic lens. So Markus, if I could turn to you, I want to ask, how does North Korea evaluate its own goals and its bargaining position? And how is the timeline for all this affected by its ability to weather sanctions?
So I think a lot of what Ankit just said is quite applicable to this question. I think first and foremost, it's important to keep in mind that as the U.S. intelligence community has consistently said, most recently in the 2019 annual threat assessment testimony from the DNI, that North Korea is seeking to negotiate only partial steps in order to be able to retain its nuclear weapons as it obtains international concessions. So essentially, North Korea is not desperate, right? And North Korea is not going to trade its full nuclear capabilities. Doesn't feel that it needs to, right? I think going back to Ankit's point about sort of how the perception of time and whose side time is on is really informed by what a fundamental change you've seen in North Korea since the 1990s. I mean, North Korea's economy is by no means in great shape right now. Sanctions are clearly, having some effect, and of course, COVID is having a tremendous effect. But in the end, you don't see North Korea in the desperate economic straits they were during the arduous March period of the 1990s when the agreed framework was coming into place and being implemented. So the premise at the time, I think, and American officials are very open about this now, was that North Korea may not even be around that much longer, and kind of thinking again that time was very much on our side. I think North Korea has turned the tables in that regard, and I think they recognize that continuing to produce weapons, continuing to produce fissile material, continuing to test periodically and demonstrate progress while overcoming the effects of sanctions, I think really puts it in a place where time is going to be potentially more on their side. So North Korea lost a lot of revenue because of the sanctions, the additional real significant sanctions that came in place in 2016 and 2017. You really started to see the effects in 2018 and that lost revenue. But by early 2019, North Korea was making really key progress in sanctions evasion and generating revenue through a variety of means, which are well documented in the news. You've seen the cyber thefts, overseas labor, illicit commercial exports, including of coal. And there's a really good body of evidence from places like Project Sandstone over at RUSI showing how successful and comprehensively North Korea has been in the maritime space, for example, overcoming and evading these sanctions. So I think overall, again, going back to what Ankit said, that it's hard to see how Pyongyang would not perceive that the time is not how they wouldn't believe the time is on their side, right? So I think that's a big factor. But going back to the starting point again. I don't think North Korea has shown any signs of veering from its objective of retaining nuclear arms, and whatever they're going to bargain away is going to be very limited, I think, in comparison to what they feel they need to retain the program. I think the other big element to keep in mind is that to reinforce their progress. There is a certain impetus to resume testing at some point, and Ankit zeroed in on the new strategic weapon comment, and I think that's a very good one. But also, let's not forget, in that same readout from the party meeting, Kim was also reported to have said that he no longer felt bound by his pledge not to test ICBMs and nuclear weapons, and so certainly North Korea, I think, would see that if they could demonstrate additional progress, not just quantitatively but qualitatively in their program, it puts more of an onus on us and puts more pressure on us and shows that they're continuing to make progress as long as there's not been some sort of deal made. So I think that sort of encapsulates my overall view. I mean, obviously we can talk about this more. I look forward to hearing what my colleagues have to say.
Thanks so much, Marcus. A really sobering assessment and good caution for us to rethink what we mean when we say time is on the US side, time is on North Korea's side. Sue, I was wondering if we could look at things from North Korea's leadership perspective. How do they view the United States? What do they mean by a hostile policy? Has their assessment changed over time? Can you get into that for us, please?
Sure. So Marcus hit on yet again another good point, which is that it's just hard to see North Korea, period. So even as a North Korea propaganda specialist, leadership specialist, I would say that our understanding of North Korea, whether that's the hostile policy or leadership intentions, leadership perspectives even, is quite constrained. And it's really based on what North Korea chooses to feed us. So I guess we could turn it around and say that, what is North Korea not feeding us? But then that just creates, I think, even, additional gaps and fissures in our knowledge. So I don't think we can really crystal ball, into North Korea's intentions with, much accuracy. I just want to state that that's a very tough job. And as we've seen in the past several months, that we think and we expect North Korea to behave in a certain way when clearly there are some curveballs thrown at us, and then we end up scrambling. We end up trying to reassess our assumptions, and we all kind of go back into this point A to point B. Let's start from square one. Going back to the North Korea's quote unquote hostile policy, U.S. hostile policy, to me it seems like a very convenient excuse for North Korea to use. So it frames clearly the United States as the aggressor, and the party unwilling to really try to play nice. So U.S. is viewed as opposing relations with North Korea from the beginning. It's defining North Korea as the enemy from the get-go. And it's refused to really recognize Pyongyang's perhaps sovereignty and its own strategic interests, and also the survivability of not the leadership, but as Pyongyang frames it, as the welfare of the entire North Korean populace. That, of course, clearly is just propaganda. But we see that the propaganda clearly works to North Korea's advantage, because it's a very nice way to peg US actions and non-actions to, hey, look, this really fits into our description of US doing nothing, while North Korea wants to make a peace agreement to end the Korean War, and it's clearly the United States who's not willing to budge. The question is, though, do we actually believe this? And for me, the question is, should we be subscribing to what North Korea is framing as not just the policy, but how the terms should be dictated? And my colleagues are right to point out that North Korea has been making qualitative and quantitative progress in their nuclear weapons and their missile capabilities. That is not something that we should be dismissing, of course. But I also think that the enforcement measures that we have in place, sanctions, also just a toughened US approach, and also coordinating with our allies, are all critical tools that we should be using, not in isolation, but in coordination all across the board. I think that and this is just my conjecture, from the North Korean leadership perspective writ large, the way the United States was responding to North Korea's, I guess, the poking and the prodding and perhaps even the pushing and the shoving, it's shown that there are certain limits that definitely can be tested, and that depending on who the leadership is in the United States and South Korea and in other countries around the world, that there really is no, as the recent years have demonstrated, there really is no principle on which I think our approach and our set of expectations when it comes to North Korea have really been pegged to. That is not something that's easily going to be backtracked or recalibrated, because once you give the opponent, adversary, ally, it really does not matter at this point. Once you give the opponent, you show your cards, and you show them that there are limits that are just nominal, and things don't really, there's no accountability on their part. There's going to be more willingness. There's going to be more emboldened attitudes from North Korea, and we see that in the way North Korea treats its most proximate neighbor, which is South Korea.
Thanks very much, Sue. And a good invitation for us to rethink the difference between North Korea's stated goals and North Korea's stated assessment of US interest and threats to its own security versus its actual assessment thereof. And there could be a big difference there. So thanks for urging us to think upon that. Ankit, new strategic weapon was mentioned. I wonder if you could help us look ahead, October, November. What do you have in mind in terms of forecasts for military parades, potential provocations? What are you thinking about here?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot on my mind. It's been a quiet year for North Korea. It's been a difficult year for North Korea, like so many countries. But I think we should look back to March. March was an interesting month. It actually represented the busiest single month of projectile launches in North Korea ever. Nine unique projectiles in the span of a single calendar month. That had never happened in my tabulations before. And of course, that followed 2 months. And I believe General Abrams from USFK publicly said that the U.S. assessment in January and February was that North Korea was taking its dictum that COVID-19 represented a threat to its national survival rather seriously. And the Korean People's Army, which normally would then be carrying out its winter training cycle, was actually under a complete pause. There was no significant military activity happening under that time. And so one of the ways in which I rationalized the surge in activity that we saw in March, including artillery firing competitions, was that it focused heavily on the morale of the KPA after this unusual pause, which I think for an armed force like the KPA, which is very much used to a different tempo of operation, was an important component. And of course, if we look at internal themes in North Korean propaganda, since I think the failure of the Hanoi summit and Kim Jong-un's return to Pyongyang and the subsequent recalibration in the fourth and fifth party congresses, the Central Committee plenums, rather, we have seen a greater emphasis on socialist discipline, self-reliance, particularly in national defense. And all of this is really a long-winded way of saying that I'm expecting something big from the October parade. I think it's going to be a way for Kim Jong-un to really emphasize to the Workers' Party, to the residents of Pyongyang, and really to the world, depending on how it's publicized, that North Korea very much remains intact. Like in the past, if people were worrying that North Korea may no longer exist in the near term, those fears have been greatly overstated. Here we get to the warnings of the new strategic weapon. There is another observation that I want to share, though, before I get to that, which is that this is a significant anniversary year. It's the 75th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party of Korea. And if we go back in time, we go back 5 years to the 70th anniversary, and we go back further to the 65th, we can take note of two important developments. So at the 2015 October parade, on the 70th anniversary occasion, North Korea introduced a new ICBM design, the one that the U.S. intelligence community calls the KN-14. This system was never flight tested. It looked like it wasn't going to be much of a missile anyways, compared to what they eventually tested in 2017. But it's notable that they introduced the system at the parade that October. On the 65th anniversary, 5 years prior in 2010, North Korea introduced the Musudan missile, the Hwasong-10, which was the first missile in the North Korean arsenal that appeared to be explicitly designed to range the U.S. territory of Guam. Again, the Hwasong-10 was not a very successful missile when it was tested in 2016. It was tested 8 times that year, succeeded only once. But the point being that, given Kim's warning of the new strategic weapon, given this precedent that we've seen with the 5-year interval anniversaries, we have all the reason in the world to expect the North Koreans to show us what they've been working on for the 2 years that they've been mostly quiet when it comes to their strategic, i.e. nuclear capable systems. In fact, since the November 2017 test of the Hwasong-15 and today, we've just seen a single missile test, which was the October 2019 test of the Pukguksong-3 submarine launch ballistic missile that would mark the test of a strategic nuclear capable system. So the North Koreans have been, I'm sure they've been holding a lot back that they're just eager to show us. And parades have been used to show us systems that haven't been tested in the past. So it's a common practice. Another development, and here I'll point to imagery analysis that just emerged in the last 24 hours, courtesy of researchers at 38 North. We see signs that the parade preparation grounds outside Pyongyang at an area known as Mirim are looking very interesting in unprecedented ways. For instance, there are several temporary shelters that could host very large missile launchers, and a lot of them. So we've been talking about the qualitative and the quantitative dynamic, and the North Koreans have done a good job of emphasizing their qualitative progress. But I think this parade might be the North Koreans' moment to show the United States and show the world that in quantitative terms, the horse has left the barn, that the North Koreans are going to come out potentially with scores of solid propellant, medium-range missiles, maybe Pukguksong-2s. They're going to parade those down Kim Il-sung Square in a way that they've never done before. And once we look at that, there are debates happening in the United States, South Korea, Japan even, about preemptive strikes, precision strikes against North Korean capabilities in a conflict. How realistic are those proposals? I personally have thought that that's a very bad idea for a long time. But if the North Koreans can show us that they have a significantly large missile force at this parade, I think the calculus and the conversation in these capitals starts to change. And I think the North Koreans might be hoping that when the next round of negotiations inevitably comes around, our side will take the hint and finally realize that it is time to do a step-by-step agreement on the path down to denuclearization, because clearly the longer we wait, the more they continue to grow.
And that's a great transition to our next question, Ankit. Before I get to that, though, I'd like to let all of our viewers know that you could submit your own question to our panelists here today. Our intern, Unji Yu, is ready to receive your questions. You could email them to policy@koreasociety.org, stating your name and affiliation, and we'll do our best to get to those. This will be our last question before we get to our audience Q&A, and we already have a bunch of questions from our audience. So now we've looked at things from the US side, we've looked at things from the North Korean side, and now we're going to address the question of what should we do, given the significant challenges that we're facing here. Should an interim deal with snapback measures be considered good progress? Should we stop at nothing but a comprehensive deal? Is it time for some sort of disarmament discussion? Let's start with Markus and ask, if denuclearization is not a realistic near-term goal, what should be the focus of diplomacy with North Korea in the near future?
So we didn't plan it this way, but Ankit, for the second time now, actually has given me a great lead in, right? So I appreciate it. So with all that at background in terms of the quantitative aspect of this, building on Kim Jong-un's order to mass produce strategic weapons in 2018, very public order. I think we also have to keep in mind there's a qualitative element here that's very important, right? Given the progress that North Korea has made due to the weapons testing and demonstrated due to the weapons testing in 2016 and 17, and the increasing credibility of the threat that results from that sort of testing. Given, in addition to that, the challenges in applying pressure that's sufficient to fundamentally change the situation, especially with China being so intransigent in many ways, I think a pragmatic approach should focus on preventing further weapons testing by North Korea before you can entertain more ambitious forms of arms control or rollback. So that doesn't mean you have to give up on denuclearization entirely. You just have to recast it more as a long-term goal and not expect to see this happen, in a rapid manner. Certainly not the Libya model, of course. So ideally, the form this could take would be a formal agreement to stop testing in exchange for something from the international community, some combination of incentives, and then also implicit threats of additional punishment through a form of sanctions, for example, that basically make it so that North Korea has a bit of a different calculus going forward about any additional testing. And I think this is, again, something that is potentially achievable. However, even if we can't get to an agreement, doing a series of things to provide North Korea with more of an incentive not to test weapons, because it seems like there's a lot of incentive as time goes on to want to do more testing to enhance the reliability and, more importantly, the credibility of the capability. So provide alternative incentives not to test, and then also make it much more clear the costs that they will potentially have to pay and the risks that they will be taking on, ideally not just from the United States, but from South Korea and other U.S. allies, even from China and Russia. It gets some more buy-in for this sort of approach. But in the end, even if we have to some extent go it alone, and I recognize it's suboptimal, doing what we can to provide more incentives to North Korea and a clearer sort of deterrence by punishment of additional testing, I think is a potentially viable approach. And what it does is it at least keeps the qualitative progress from North Korea's weapons programs from being locked in. And it certainly then potentially halts the erosion of the credibility of U.S. extended deterrence and all the other negative things with the increasing that come with the increasing capabilities of North Korea. And then the beauty of this approach too is if we can get to an agreement with North Korea, then I think we could potentially see ability to mobilize more international pressure and more support for a U.S. Approach if North Korea then breaches the agreement, which they very well might, right? I mean, there's a lot of history there. But I think it's realistic because 2018 showed there's a precedent, right? North Korea did stop weapons testing in 2018. So under Kim Jong-un, we've seen this even without an agreement now. So I think getting back to that place where North Korea is not testing, I think is some sort of progress. It's not the beginning necessarily or the end, but I think it is really an important focus in the first step. And I think it doesn't get, in my view, sufficient attention because of the focus on these larger, longer term goals, which are going to be much harder to achieve.
Thanks so much, Markus. Good starting base for how we should look at things going forward. Let's turn to Ankit. Ankit, what are your thoughts here?
So yes, I'll just point out the value of the idea that Markus just presented, which I think is something that we should take seriously. I mean, just to give you an example, in 2016, when it appeared quite likely that the North Koreans were about to cross some very important milestones, which they did cross in 2017. there were a lot of us in the independent analyst community who were making the case that, the freeze for freeze proposal, which was really branded as a Chinese and Russian initiative, had value precisely for the reason that what Markus said, that if we can prevent the North Koreans from testing any missiles, that means they won't be able to test an ICBM. And if they're not able to test an ICBM, they won't have the kind of rudimentary minimum deterrent that they now claim to enjoy. And frankly, they have the right to enjoy that because they have conducted the minimal number of tests necessary to at least sow in the minds of American policymakers the risk that North Korea could deliver a nuclear weapon to the US. So there are other developments that we can very directly look to prevent there. We don't want the North Koreans to have opportunities to refine their warheads and reentry vehicles. We don't want them to have multiple reentry vehicles. We don't want them to have larger missiles capable of hurling bigger payloads, including multiple warheads. So there's a lot to be done there on the qualitative side. Another point that I want to make, and this is not a technical point, this is more sort of on the politics of negotiating. I do unfortunately think that some of the things that we've seen in recent months particularly, but really for the past 2 years, in the Iran context, I'm talking specifically here in the way the administration has handled the aftermath of its May 2018 decision to leave the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Of course, the Iran context is very different from a disarmament problem. Iran never had nuclear weapons to be disarmed of, for instance. But the JCPOA had certain innovative ideas to offer for a potential future North Korea scenario. And one of those ideas, which I think you referenced earlier, Jonathan, is the notion of snapback or some sort of mechanism that we build into a interim deal or even a more comprehensive deal to ensure that if the North Koreans defect or cheat or do something we don't like, we're able to credibly punish them in a non-military way. And of course, we've seen what has become of snapback in the past few weeks and months. The administration has, and quite frankly, made a farce of Security Council Resolution 2231. But why does this matter for North Korea? I think any future agreement we do with the North Koreans is inherently going to now exact something of a risk premium. And the risk premium I'm talking about here really pertains to shifts in American domestic politics that affect our foreign policy. And the North Koreans here, I think, will actually have a long memory, right? This won't be the first experience for them. They, I think, recall quite vividly the transition from the Clinton administration to the Bush administration, and not only the implementation problems for the agreed framework, delayed heavy fuel oil deliveries because Republican Congress didn't want to play with the Democratic president, but also the general aversion to arms control under the Bush administration. And now, especially given how we've seen the Trump administration handle some of the Obama era agreements, not just including the Iran deal, the North Koreans would be very well positioned to ask future U.S. negotiators for an additional price. So that means that we now need to be ready to pay a larger price than we would have paid in the past to conclude an agreement with the North Koreans that might include something like snapback. So it's obviously a very unfortunate place to be, but I think it does emphasize that a lot of what's happened in the past 3 years will, I think, have significant costs in negotiations with the North Koreans and others in the coming years.
Thanks so much. Can we now turn to Soo? Soo, can you explore a little bit the regional context and multilateralism? What potential roles might there be for China and Japan?
Sure. So I was actually thinking about what Markus and Ankit were proposing. And I guess the bigger question I had in response, or I guess just overall looking at the configuration we have right now in the region, is really like, would our allies be okay in Seoul and Tokyo, and even our, I guess, partners, if we want to call them that, China and Russia? Would they actually be okay with an interim deal, an arms control agreement, or something that is still going to leave North Korea with the basic capabilities of really the temptation to want to use those weapons again to threaten and to really to extort more? I think the answer is pretty clear in some countries more than others, but we do have to think about where that leaves our allies. I mean, that are we going to be able to provide them with the security guarantees, for one, but that also sort of leaves them, I think, hanging out to dry. As much as the United States can assure South Korea and Japan that we are going to be standing beside them when whatever happens from North Korea, that is still not going to be, I think, enough to allay concerns, existential concerns, really, about living with a nuclear armed North Korea that consistently gets rewarded for its bad behavior. I think also the question that keeps coming back to me is, the question is, it's not when we can prevent North Korea from provoking or to test, but it's actually the question about if. So I think that if actually, it reduces our leverage collectively, United States, South Korea, Japan, United Nations, and other willing partners, our leverage has been lost. And then the question about, the potential for North Korea to cheat, that there, I think it's more of an if, but when, because we know North Korea is going to cheat. So then if we already know going into the game that the other partner is not going to cooperate, then why are we so willing to sign something that is only going to have short-term benefits and potentially create further, I guess, uncertainties and it's just going to create a lot of questions about security alliances, questions about alliance dynamics. I think also we also have to look at how we, the United States, of course, but also our allies are responding to or digesting the U.S.-China competition space. So interestingly for South Korea, a treaty U.S. ally, it's caught, as it says, between the U.S.-China competition. So we see rhetoric from the South Korean officials saying that they are put in a bind where they have to choose one or the other. Now, the question is that really the case? Because when you think about prioritization of national interests, of course, we can argue that economic interest is also important, but you cannot have in the Korean Peninsula where a South Korea is constantly threatened, or quote unquote, living under a nuclear North Korean threat constantly. What is, just the risk calculations aside, it's pretty evident what is important to them. And for certain countries to say that they are put in a bind, I think is one, it sort of defers the decision back to Beijing and also Washington. For us to try to recalibrate our position towards our allies, of course, but also our position toward the North Korea problem. So I think that also poses constraints. And also on matters of alliance, it's not just about having a shared common vision toward the North Korean threat, but I think we need to have a comprehensive, coordinated, overlapping approach on all aspects of the alliance, because that is how we strengthen our approach when it comes to dealing with North Korea, when it comes to dealing with other security threats around the region. So I don't think that there's a solid grasp answer for this, but I just think that given the situation that we're in right now, it just seems like an ideal constellation of stars for North Korea, because everything just seems to be working towards Pyongyang's favor.
Thank you so much, Sue. Really good points there. We're going to proceed to a speed round, getting to some of our audience questions. But first, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Fred Moss, one of our viewers, would like to compliment Ankit on your bottle collection, which is displayed nicely behind you. Last time during a program with Ankit, your socks got a compliment. So it seems like the viewers were very interested. Let's turn to Markus. Markus, there was a question about intensifying U.S. Strategic competition with China, and that's how that's going to impact U.S.-North Korea relations, something that Sue addressed. I wonder if you can unpack that a little bit more.
So I think one of the key things to keep in mind is the multilateral dynamics here that are at play in U.S.-China strategic competition, how they apply to both North and South Korea. My former deputy, Jung Pak, who's now with Brookings, wrote this excellent article called, I think, Tugging at the Linchpin, a reference to China's strategy of going after South Korea as a linchpin in the U.S. alliances in Northeast Asia. And so I think there's a big element here where China is actually not so much focused on North Korea in the near term, but is really focused on trying to drive a wedge between South Korea and the United States. And to the extent where the North Korean nuclear issue is a means to do that, of course, I think they'll leverage that. I'm planning on actually doing some more writing and work in this space of looking at the larger consequences for the Korean Peninsula of U.S.-China strategic competition and vice versa. But some of my initial findings, also include the idea that it basically, as long as this is a continuing issue, North Korea being nuclear, it does mean that China has a certain amount of potential, at least leverage, or at least is needed, but to some degree by both the United States and South Korea. So it sort of militates against the idea that China actually wants to solve the nuclear problem as opposed to leverage it to its advantage. I'm not saying I'm sure about that, but certainly that seems to be one of the initial things that I'm hearing. I think another big element too is how much pressure it puts on the presence of U.S. forces in South Korea and ROK U.S. exercises, because certainly this is an area where China, North Korea, and Russia are all united, I think, in their view and in their, at least in their rhetoric, about the fact that U.S. military activity on the Korean Peninsula, the presence of U.S. forces, is not conducive to their interests. So I think this whole issue of the pressure for South Korea to move away from the United States is going to come from China. The pressure on the U.S. military presence and on the combined ROK U.S. exercises, I think those will all be key elements. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention THAAD, right? I think that will be a continuing issue, a continuing point where even if militarily THAAD is probably not nearly as big of a challenge for China as is being portrayed by their propaganda, certainly it is something that symbolically the fact that the South Koreans did in the end support the deployment of THAAD, or at least accept the deployment of THAAD into South Korea, the THAAD battery. I think that China is continuing to try and think about how this factors into their longer term approach of how can they get South Korea to basically reconsider and move a bit more away from the United States. And so given that this is a speed round, I feel like we could have a whole session on U.S.-China strategic competition in the Korean Peninsula. Maybe we should at some point, but I think I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Marcus. Great food for thought. We're going to turn now to Ankit. There's a question from Dukin Han, who is a reporter at Radio Free Asia. And Dukin would like to ask, what is the status of North Korea's current relationship with Syria and other countries in the Middle East more broadly?
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So relationships, the relationship between Syria and North Korea has really goes back to Kim Il-sung and Hafez al-Assad. It's been strong ever since then. The relationship took an interesting turn, of course, when the North Koreans built a reactor for the Syrians modeled on Yongbyon, which was blown up by the Israeli Air Force in 2007. That was thought to be, of course, one of their most infamous attempts at nuclear proliferation in the region. But more recently, in the Syrian civil war, you've had Korean People's Army technicians, particularly assisting the Syrians with air defense. The UN panel of experts has commented on possible North Korean assistance to Syria's chemical weapons program. So really, it's a relationship that is full of trouble for the region and certainly for U.S. interests, but it continues to remain strong. So it is, along with Iran, Syria is one of North Korea's most important partners historically on proliferation and military cooperation in the region.
Wow, speed round indeed. Thank you very much, Ankit. Next question comes from Charlie Kimball. He's at the Korea Center for International Finance. He wants to ask a little bit about the transition of leadership in Japan and how that's going to affect Japan-North Korea relations, Japan-Korea relations. Sue, could you unpack that a little bit for us?
Sure. I'll start with Japan-South Korea relations because it seems to be the hotter issue for the past couple months. South Korean president had actually just sent out like a letter congratulating now Prime Minister Suga for his, I guess, ascendance into the position. There seems to be a superficial, I would say, expectation or hope that Seoul-Tokyo relations would be on the mend. And I think that given, at least from the South Korean perspective, given that there has been a consistent, insistent push towards repairing certain aspects about the South Korea-Japan relationship, that Japan, from its perspective, has mentioned that it's been resolved that unless both countries decide to basically jump over the historical elements and really focus on their common interests and really just the realities of dealing with so many security challenges, the North Korea problem aside, there are, again, questions about where Japan situates itself between the United States and China. I think that's more clear from Chogyu's perspective than South Korea. With North Korea, I do not really see Japan's position really shifting that much. There might be overtures or, again, public statements that say that Japan is willing to work with our allies and partners to resolve the North Korea problem. Perhaps the prime minister would be willing to meet with Kim Jong-un. But again, the rhetoric aside, I think when it comes to the actual the policy changes, or perhaps seeing movement, person-to-person movement, and really the visual progress in relations with Seoul and also with Pyongyang, to me, it just seems like we are going to be continuing on the path that we have been in since the Abe prime ministership.
So much, a lot to think about. Perhaps improvement on the kidnapping issue could be a contingency for further improvement of relations between Japan and North Korea. This has been a packed session, really dense, so many fresh insights. I want to provide everybody, all of our speakers, an opportunity to plug their recent work. But before we do that, I want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in today. Thank you so much. We've got a lot of great programming coming up, some covering the U.S. presidential election. So please check out koreasociety.org to look forward to those programs. We've also got our annual gala, which will be virtual this year. So we encourage you to please check out our website and support that if you can. Also want to do a quick shout out to some of my colleagues, Tom, Stephen, Claire, Unji, for all the help in making today a reality. I feel like it was a great kickoff to this program series. And Ankit, Markus, Soo, thank you so much. Markus, can you start off? What are you working on these days? Can you give us a little plug for some of your new work?
So I alluded to a couple things already, including this longer term focus that I've got on the Korean Peninsula vis-a-vis US-China strategic competition. But in the near term, I'm really focused on the strategic weapon issues with North Korea, particularly this new strategic weapon and the potential for resumption of testing. And I've been working with an old friend, Bruce Perry, who retired out of the US Pacific Command, who actually was the #2 in the team that determined it was a North Korean sub that sank the Cheonan back in 2010, and we've been working on looking at analysis of the strategic relevance and aspects of the SLBM threat versus mobile land-based missiles. And as those of you heard me speak before, I mean, I think it'll come as no surprise that we're very concerned about the mobile land-based missiles in light of what Ankit said earlier. Of course, that qualitative and quantitative growth and the size of that mobile missile force, to me, that's a very immediate concern, whereas I think the SLBM is more of a longer term concern. We should keep an eye on it. So that's some of the things we'll be working on. I'm planning an event through Scowcroft Center where we're going to be talking about this. And then, of course, we're also planning, Bruce and I, to publish an article on this, hopefully next week on this topic. So those are some of the near-term things I'm working on. I'll be interested to see how the parade turns out, what happens in October, and then that'll probably drive the focus a little bit more going forward.
Excellent. Lots to look forward to. Soo, how about you?
No books that I'm working on, but I think I'm pretty busy with the RAND job, the teaching gig at AU, and I just started a doctoral program at SAIS. So I think that'll keep me busy. But I think, I guess I would just like people's support in listening to not just my views, but also just how important the Korea issues are really to US interests. So I guess a bigger plug for Korea problems. Yeah.
Thanks, Soo. Great. And now Ankit.
Well, I guess I still have a book to plug. So if you were if your eyes were glazing over when I was talking about Pokukseong 2s and Hwasong 10s, and you're curious about what those things are or why they matter, my book might have answers. I will say though, so Carnegie has been sort of a new perch for me. I've just been there since July and I'm still sort of getting settled in. But one of the things I hope to do some work on is verification in North Korea, because I think it actually still matters. I mean, this was a pessimistic conversation when it came to the ability to do a deal with the North Koreans, but anytime we do a deal, we're going to need to verify things. And what really motivates me right now is that future agreements with the North Koreans, verification was never easy with North Korea. The IAEA has been out of the country since April 2009. American inspections during the agreed framework era were never comfortable. So basically what I'm interested in doing is work on thinking through novel approaches to verification. How can we verify things in North Korea with limited access, with much less than the kind of access we would want in an ideal world? Because if there's anything, studying North Korea teaches me is that we don't live in an ideal world. So that's something I'm working on, but it's all very early on. So I hope I'll have more to share on that soon. Thanks.
Thank you, Ankit. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you to all of our viewers. Hope you have a great day.